Hi everyone, my name is Taylor and I am the author of the YA horror novel Hollow, which comes out from Peachtree Teen in fall 2025. That's this year. Um, and I am also the author of the YA horror fantasy of Auras and Shadows, also coming out from Peachtree Teen in fall 2026. I am so excited to present today on autism and writing. I'm an autistic author, and I'm very interested in how writing and autism intersect. My characters are autistic, and I just find the topic to be generally really fun, really fascinating. The writer's workout is fantastic. Thank you guys so much for inviting me to speak on this very important information. So before I begin, I'm just going to lay out how this presentation is going to go. First, I'm going to give you an overview of what we're going to cover, and then we're going to move into more generative pieces. So how to write with autism, autistic characters, how to conceptualize young adult novels with autism and autistic characters. So let's get going. Here you can see the layout of the presentation. So in the first half of the presentation, we're just going to talk brass tacks. What is autism? How does it impact writing? The things I use from a place of disability to write books, and the conceptualization of writing as an autistic person. And then in the second half of the presentation, we're going to talk about tricks of the trade, how to prevent burnout, structuring the novel, and writing autistic characters in young adult novels. Finally, we're going to talk about authenticity, which is a relatively divisive topic. So let's get started. What is autism? I think it's important before we begin to discuss really what this developmental disorder is. With the advent of TikTok, this word autism has gotten thrown around a lot, so has the term Asperger's. So I want to just start by discussing what this thing is, why it's important to talk about it. So, autism is defined by the National Institute of Mental Health as a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how people interact with others, communicate, learn, and behave. Autism can be diagnosed throughout life. A lot of people are diagnosed when they're quite young, but I was diagnosed as an adolescent and then again as an adult. Late diagnosis is totally valid, as well as self-diagnosis. Self-diagnosis is when somebody goes through either a test online or speaks to their neurodivergent friends, especially those who are also autistic, and receives what we jokingly call a peer review autism diagnosis without speaking to a mental health professional. Late diagnosis is when an adult or a late adolescent goes to a mental health professional and gets properly diagnosed in person with a piece of paper. Both of them completely valid, and it's important to treat them as such. Late diagnosis often occurs in AFAB, so that's assigned female at birth, or femme presenting populations. That's because when autism was first conceptualized as a diagnosis, it was kind of a bad little boy disorder. But we've learned a lot about how AFAB people present, and it's markedly different from how AMAB people, assigned male at birth people, present. There is kind of this prevalent and harmful theory that autism is a superpower. It's not. It's a developmental disability. And it's also a disorder that occurs on a spectrum. So those with autism can display a wide array of symptoms. And there are people with low support needs versus high support needs. These can fluctuate throughout life, even throughout the day, throughout the week. Sometimes I'm on the low end and sometimes I'm on the high end. It kind of just depends. However, despite being a developmental disability, autism can come with strengths that are not often exhibited in the general community. Autistic folks often have very good pattern recognition, a strong sense of social and moral justice, a keen attention to detail, and can hyperfocus. Hyperfocus is when someone can focus on something for a long amount of time in a really concerted way. So, how does autism impact writing? First, let me give you a general disclaimer. These are my unique experiences. Anyone with autism or other neurodivergencies might experience their disabilities differently than I do. With that said, autistic brains tend to be logical pattern recognition machines. A lot of autistic kids are really good at puzzles and Legos. They're really good at word searches and crosswords. My favorite thing to do is a crossword. You'll never take them away from me. You can pry them out of my cold, dead hands. And as you probably know, writing is kind of inherently about patterns and plot. Often autistic people, including me, dissect books. How do they tick? How do they work? I love reading for plot and pattern because it's so informative for writing. As a writer, it's such a great tool to have in my toolkit. Developing that plot is the ultimate pattern, right? I love sitting down and plotting a book. That is probably the most divisive opinion I will give in this entire presentation, that plotting is fun. For me, it is, because I can dissect how a book works, both reading it and writing it. More complex plots require more patterning. So if there are multiple plot strands going on in a book, that means that there are more patterns I have to put into my outline to make it kind of function better. Writing is also deeply personal, and it's often about disability for me. I love writing about characters with autism, but I also love writing as an autistic person. I like how my brain conceptualizes the book. My own writing meditates on the line between ability and disability. It's important to understand that because autism functions on a spectrum and because autism support needs can fluctuate, I am abled sometimes and I am disabled sometimes. I always have autism, but the way my autism presents day to day, minute to minute can change. And so in characters, in books, it's fun for me to ride that line. Sometimes my characters are perfectly abled and they're able to function within their framework, but sometimes they are disabled. They have a meltdown, they reach burnout, they get overwhelmed, they have trouble with social situations. And so learning those characters, understanding who they are uniquely with their disabilities, is really fascinating for me. I also enjoy talking about how society pigeonholes autistic folks. We've come a long way since the bad little boy disorder that autism used to be conceived as. I think that's an important theme to address in a book. Autistic folks are not geniuses often, but they are unique and interesting individuals. The stereotypical genius trope versus the socially awkward dunce, those are two ends of a complete fallacy. Autistic people are multifaceted and they have varying interests, but they are disabled. I also like talking about burnout in my books. Burnout is something we'll talk about a little bit more later in this presentation, but it's essentially when somebody is no longer able to function. I find that to be a really interesting plot motivator. Disability overall is an incredibly rich topic. Autism is no different. I want to take a step back and talk about how I structure my writing toolkit as an autistic person. I like to think of it as externalized versus internalized needs. I am not a person who can write with music. Some people can do that. I absolutely cannot. I need a quiet room when I'm writing. It quiets my brain too. And with that comes an organized writing space. I put it here as organized writing space, but I actually call it a quiet space. The first thing I do before writing is I clear my desk and I make it quiet and easy and simple, because for me, if there's too much for my brain to grab at and look at, I'm not going to be able to write. I often have a set writing plan, and that goes along with a solid outline. So I know how many words I need to write a day when I sit down. And that is dependent on my outline. My outline tells me what I'm writing. So together, I have kind of a good amount of information to begin with. Internally, too, I need to have a quiet brain that depends a lot on my environment. And I also need to have a well-rested brain. I have 2 kids, and so that part can kind of be a challenge. But I'm a professional writer, and so regardless, I need to get it done somehow. Sleep is important. Let's just say that. I have anxiety too, so I personally need space to be anxious while I'm writing. My anxiety doesn't go away, and I've learned to write with it. Anxiety and autism have a high rate of comorbidity. They occur together often. And when I write with anxiety, I have a higher rate of burnout. So overall, if I write too much, if I overextend myself too much, if I'm too anxious, I burn out faster. Burning out when you're a professional writer is kind of a fact of life. You have deadlines, you have all of these big and heavy topics, you have editors in your inbox and agent calls, so you have to come up with ways to motivate yourself. For me, that means I need a structure. Let's talk about autistic burnout. What is it? This is another one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. It's not just being tired. Let's dispel that myth right now. Autistic burnout is something deeply, deeply affecting. It's not like a nap can fix it. According to the National Autistic Society, autistic burnout is a syndrome resulting from chronic life stress and a mismatch of expectations and abilities without adequate supports, characterized by pervasive exhaustion, loss of function, and reduced tolerance to stimulus. This is the key. It is a syndrome. It is not just me getting too tired to write. It is literally impossible to engage with the work, or almost impossible, let me say. So it's important to prevent it at all costs. The way I do that is taking adequate breaks between my writing sessions, seeking communal support, engaging in non-harmful tics and stims. I personally love having little spinny things on my desk. Very helpful, spinny things. That is a writer term. I take a lot of brain breaks. I play cello, and I find that taking breaks to play cello really helps me. I also have a lot of psychological buttressing. I have a therapist who I work with for burnout reasons. I also schedule myself pretty strictly. If I overexert myself, there's absolutely no way I'm going to write a book without burning out because I hyperfocus. It is vital, if you have autism, to prevent that hyperfocus from taking over your entire writing day. It just is. Otherwise, you can finish a book very quickly, but you're going to be totally burned out on the other side. Unfortunately, sometimes you are in burnout and you need to write. As a professional writer, this happens to me all the time, unfortunately. Sometimes you just have to push through. I have a very supportive family, though, and they understand when, at the end of the day, I need to just kind of hole up under the covers. I request extensions. I develop a manageable schedule with my agent, and I rely on support tools like outlines and nightly reading. And yes, touching grass, so important. Getting outside changes everything. Okay, let's be real though. Sometimes you get burnout and you absolutely cannot write, and it is important to listen to your brain and body. It's crucial to rest. I call it the needles and eyes feeling. You know, when you open your doc and you're like, I literally cannot do this, or I'm going to pass away on the spot. You need to stop. End of story. Let's get into the actual writing bit. Let's say you're not burned out, or mostly not burned out. How do you structure your novel? Well, I break my novels into 3 parts: plot, character, and vibes. And for me, each need to be developed before I even begin writing. It is not possible for me to start writing without these pieces. And so I've given you the ways I approach each part. Number 1, plot. Incredibly important, obviously. It's the backbone of the book. So Find an outline structure that works for you. I really like Save the Cat. There are so many resources online. I like the 4-act outlines because for me, it breaks the book into manageable bits. Plot is, as I said, really important because there are expectations of genre standards with plot, and knowing your plot mitigates the problem of a passive plot. Maintaining forward motion is dependent on having a good outline. Sorry, pantsers. I'm sorry, discovery writers. In my opinion, as somebody who used to be a pantser, that is, for people who don't know, just writing a novel without an outline, my books used to peter out around the midpoint, soggy middle. Everybody knows it and hates it, right? Plotting your work means that you can see where you lose momentum and work to actively fix it before it becomes a problem. The second part of novel structure is character. I rely a lot on character archetypes. That doesn't mean that all my characters are the same, but it means that I can kind of look at my characters and say, okay, you're a morally gray man. Win. You are a hero character. That's a really helpful thing to have when you're kind of lost in the soggy middle of your book and you're like, well, what does my character actually want? I also use the D&D method of like lawful good, chaotic evil. Where does my character fall on this? I think it's really fun to conceptualize a character based on their moral structure. We love to see it. I also do an in-depth development for every character I write, from everything from astrology to past traumas to like, I always joke, I fell down a storm drain when I was 9 years old. So like, did my character fall down a storm drain when they were 9 years old? Let's get into it. But for the purposes of this presentation, let's also think about disability in character. Do they share your disability? You have to also somehow avoid the accidental self-insert. The way you do that is by relying on the last kind of character metrics I covered. While it's really fun to see parts of yourself in your characters, you don't want to actually accidentally write yourself into a book. Sensitivity readers can help you if you're writing outside of your perspective. We're going to cover that a little bit later too. And the last thing that I rely on is the vibes, arguably the most fun part of writing a book, for me anyway. I use mood boards and Pinterest boards. I love putting together an aesthetic for a book. For me, it's really helpful, especially when I'm working in world building. It's a nice thing to have if you're kind of like, well, what does my world look like? Or like, is it cold? What season is it? Pinterest boards help. I personally don't listen to music while I write, but I do make a playlist when I'm done with a book. It's just good to give to your readers. I'll just say that. Allow your brain, though, to seriously run free at this part. Free association, spider charts, just go wild, honestly. Free writes for character that don't even make it into the book, sometimes the most helpful thing you can do. Okay, my 2 books are young adult novels. I also write adult, but the 2 books that I have that are actively being published are young adult. And so I want to talk about the kinds of ways we include disability in young adult novels too. This is a pretty complete list, but there are always things you can add. So if you have questions for me, definitely let me know. So number 1, when you're defining an autistic character, be sure to develop a 3-dimensional person, not a caricature. Deeply important, right? Autistic people are people. They're not flat characterizations of their disability. If you have autism, which I hope you do if you're writing an autistic main character, that's another thing we'll cover later. It's important to think deeper than the disability too. An autistic person's personality is defined by their disability, but it's not all they are, right? I am still a 3-dimensional person despite having autism. Number 2, define where your character falls on the autism spectrum disorder spectrum. What are their support needs? What are their energy levels? Remember that these fluctuate throughout the day and therefore throughout your book. Showing that a character who has a disability can ask for help or not is vital in developing who they are. Importantly, that means number 3, disability is sometimes at odds with your plot. In what ways does the plot impinge on an autistic person? In what ways can it support an autistic character? Think about social supports and places where society lets the character down. I wrote a book recently about a character, an autistic character, on a boat in the middle of an ocean. Obviously, this is not a great situation for an autistic person, or at least most autistic people, myself included. They're surrounded by people. There's no way out. It's very stressful. And so the entire plot develops for the character as a burnout mechanism, right? So like from the beginning to the end of the book, the character gets more and more and more overstimulated and burned out. And that affects everything in the book. That affects the character's relationships. That affects the speed of the plot. That affects the kinds of choices they make towards the end of the book. These are the things that when you're writing a character with a disability, specifically autism, you have to think about. Number 4, and this is so important, avoid ableist terminologies when describing your character. Remember, high functioning and low functioning are not applicable terms. That is something that I won't go into really in this presentation. You should do some research on it if you haven't already. Importantly, though, when your autistic character meets another character who is ableist, you can include those terminologies. These are realities for autistic people. People describe autistic folks in a myriad modelly ways. That's important to show, to be realistic to these characters' lived experiences. But crucially, that's not the same thing as the author being ableist toward their own character. I urge you to look up ableist terminologies for autism. There are a lot of them. But in this context, I think it's important to just jot down a list at the beginning of your book. Don't refer to your characters as stupid or slow or any of these terrible terms that sometimes have been used in the past for autistic people. Remember, number 5, child characters come with special considerations: diagnosis, self-diagnosis, school, being ostracized socially. In the book that I am releasing in the fall, my main character, Cassie, has just been diagnosed. She is a high school junior, and she is deeply upset by her diagnosis. She knows that throughout her life, there's something different about her, and it led to a major meltdown, which is kind of the crux of the book. But she is more struggling with naming this disability because she thinks it will change the way other people view her. And she's right. It will. As a kid, let's try and remember, school is your whole life. It's where you spend all your time. It's your social nexus. And when you have a disability, that can be really traumatic. So try and think about the times as a teen or a child that really defined your disability. The kinds of things that affected your understanding of yourself are often seen through that disabled lens. Those considerations are incredibly important when developing a young adult novel with an autistic main character. Number 6, though, infantilization is a very fine line in young adult lit. Remember that children and teens with autism are capable, resilient human beings. I often say that the toughest people I know are autistic teenagers. These kids are hitting puberty, starting dating maybe, having sex for the first time with autism. That comes with a whole host of like sensory sensitivities and social issues and hierarchies. Learning who these people are requires us to have a degree of sensitivity about their abilities. They are resilient humans. It's important that we treat them as such in our books. Number 7, plot considerations. Children are often constrained in different ways than adults. Mobility, access, social supports, intentions of the adults in their lives. Plot motivations can cause friction or allow these kids avenues throughout the story. Consider that kids can't just leave school if they're upset or meltdown. Or consider that kids don't really have the same access as adults. They can't vote, they can't drink really. These things are important plot considerations. In Hollow, my book that's coming out this year, Cassie has to ask her mom for access to go on this camping trip. Her mom eventually gives her permission, but it's very fraught. And Cassie's entire experience, and indeed the entire plot of the story, hinge on the conversation she has with her mom about accessing this social interaction. It creates a lot of stress for Cassie, and I think really informs the tone of the book throughout the first third. So when you're thinking about writing young adult with an autistic main character, consider that the adults in their lives might be worried too about their kids' interactions as an autistic person. Finally, number 8, young adult is all about a journey of growth, whether positive or negative. A young adult main character with a disability often has different considerations than an abled character. Consider for a second that when an autistic person is learning who they are, that is going to look very different than when an abled person is trying to figure out who they are too. I think it's vital that when you're writing down your plot and you're working on your characterizations, you think about what the goals are for your character. An autistic person will probably have different goals. For example, Cassie's goals are fitting in with her friend group again. That's it. One goal. It informs the entire book structure. She is desperately searching for a place where she fits. That's her growth journey, realizing that she's who she is and that is okay. Okay, we have come a long way in this presentation, 28 minutes. We need to have a conversation, guys, about writing autism without having autism. This is a very divisive topic because books are traditionally a place where you can explore worlds that are not your own. And that's right. But in this specific case, if you are considering writing an autistic main character while you don't yourself have autism, I strongly urge you to ask yourself why. Why do you want to write an autistic main character if you yourself are not autistic? Because my lived experiences as an autistic person are not the same as learned experiences. You can learn all day long about autism, but that will not give you the same experience I have. Authentic representation comes from a place of self-knowledge. This is an important one. If you don't struggle every day with your disability, if you have never been ostracized socially, if you have never been diagnosed or self-diagnosed autism in yourself, then how do you know what it feels like? Books are the most impactful when writing from a place of authenticity. Disability is not a buzzword. Please consider that autistic people are also trying to break into the publishing industry. And what makes it harder is when abled people take those spots while writing about autistic characters. However, if you do decide to write an autistic main character while differently disabled, whether you have ADHD or BPD or any other kind of social disability, engage the paid services of a sensitivity reader. Again, authenticity matters. If your sensitivity reader has autism, they will be able to say yes or no, you represented this character, right or wrong. Remember, autism has a long history of being vilified or valorized depending on the relative strengths of the individual with autism. So it's important to consider that maybe your conceptualization of a character with autism doesn't quite fit while trying to break that terrible history. Child characters are especially susceptible to these harmful trope developments, so an authenticity and sensitivity reader can read specifically for that. Autistic side characters, this is the one difference. Autistic side characters also require sensitivity reads, but it's important to know that wide representation in novels is actually really appreciated. As long as they're not writing from the perspective of an autistic character, sensitive portrayal of a character with autism as a side character is actually really quite nice. We want that. We want our characters in our cast of characters to not be monoliths. Side characters are so welcome. Cannot stress that enough. But do remember to get them sensitivity read. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. I hope you found it helpful and interesting and hopefully a tiny little bit informative. I so look forward to hearing your feedback. Have a great day.